Jim raised very pertinent question. And I think that question should not only speak to the two projects he mentioned. I think it has to do with all of you. Could you go back to your drawing board and see that your questions, your research question and your objectives and your research methods and methodology are speaking to each other? There must not be a disjuncture. If your research question and objective is looking east and your research method and methodology is looking west, there's a problem there. So this is a kind of a reminder to all the projects. Think through your research methods and research methodology to see what is appropriate. You've just been given so much to chew. No one is asking you to force yourself to take all the methodologies and methods that have been put out there. Look at what is appropriate for you against the backdrop of the kind of question and objective that you've set out for yourself. So Jim told us that your research method or research methodology should derive necessarily from your research question and objective, not the other way around. So don't put your research methodology and, oh, I like feminist theology, put it first, and then you are using that to look for the question. That will be putting the cart before the horse. Last thing, and I just wanted to sound this as a warning and caution to all of us, to be aware of the danger of generalizations, the danger of essentialization. We are always caught in that trap. And my comment in this regard is to be careful. What I want to say is not in a derogatory or a negative term. Sometimes some scholars talk about Mbiti syndrome, but in a very positive way. Mbiti, in his classical works on African religions and philosophy, has talked about Africans are incurably religious. But that may be true, but the question would be, is this a statement of fact? And I think this enables us, or is it a speculation? So we need to be reinterrogating this. This could actually be a research question for someone against the debate about what is religious and secular, and whether we have secularization as an ongoing process in Africa and so on and so forth. So necessarily, this is no, we can review, we can regurgitate some of what has been put out there, but I think revisiting them constantly helps us to make a step forward. So I just wanted to share this. Let's be very careful to say Africans believe this, Africans do that, Africans eat this. These are huge generalizations sometimes. This is not to say that there are no commonalities. Africans don't share certain worldviews and commonalities. But the question would be, whose Africa are you talking about? So I just wanted to add this as a footnote. Okay, so let's have the last session for the day. I think, again, I would like to re-echo the very important points that Jim raised in the last session. And I'm sure that because he's here with us for the rest of the week, I would employ different project teams to strike a deal with him. He's a very busy man, so catch him now and get him to mess up your project. Mess it up with the intention of refining it. And whatever insights he brings, I'm sure that with your project advisors, you can think through the feedback, not just from him, but also other colleagues that are here present. So this will be a very informal session. And if you don't ask questions, if you don't have any comments, then this session is going to be brief. So I will really employ you project leaders, team members pose whatever additional questions, particularly emanating from Jim's very detailed presentation. And if you don't do that, forever hold your peace. So let me open it up now for questions. And let's follow the same procedure of either you raise your hands virtually or manually, or paste your comment or question, and then we would get to it. So
let me start with a comment, Afa. The question that came up in the last session had to do with lining up the research question with the kind of data that you were gathering. And when I say you do your research question first in the design process, I don't mean that you're stuck with that question by the time you get into the field. Because what you may discover is you've got a research question that you can't answer because you can't get the kind of data that will answer it. And so in that situation, it's perfectly okay to go back and change your research question. I've actually even done that very late in a study. That is, I did a study of religious social activists. I think I mentioned it yesterday. This was a long time ago, but it was an interview study, and I was interested in how those activists drew the relationship between their long-term activism, and they were everywhere from 5 years full-time, in one case, to 60 years of full-time religious social activism. How they drew that connection themselves between their spiritual lives and their activist lives. So obviously I was lining up the questions, I needed to interview people for this. That was great. But I'd done 65 interviews and I was not finding any patterns. And the rule of thumb when you're doing an interview study is you start with 30, because I've never seen a study that does anything serious with less than 30. And when you've done the 30, you look back at the last 5 and say, okay, did I find anything new? And if you didn't, you do 5 more and then you're done if you still don't find anything new. But I had not saturated by the time I was 65, and I could have spent the rest of my life doing this. So I took that data and went back and asked a different question about that data. It still had to be one that could be answered in the way that I was with the data I had. But you can go change your question. You just got to make sure that the two things line up well analytically. And it worries me when things don't. Anyway, that's the editorial comment at the beginning. But
thank you, Jim.
The other thing is that I added a few extra items to the Dropbox for which I gave you the address yesterday. And I have just put that address in the chat again, so that if you need access to it, there's more there now than there was when I first gave it to you.
Thank you, Jim. Let's not make this Jim affair. There are several veterans here. Joel is here, Jehu is here, Retif is here, Wanda is here, Damaris. So let's be interactive here. So whatever 2 cents you have to add, please do that. If you don't speak, I'll put you on the spot and I call you.
Yeah, I'll respond to Teo who put a private notice in the chat. Yeah, sure, we can talk with your team later this week. Just work it out.
Joel, I see you smiling. That is an indication you have something to say.
Well, sure. I really second Jim's admonition to let your research talk to you, and let it talk you out of some questions if need be. I say the whole process, on through writing. My doctoral advisor told me that, and this shows how long ago I was working, your typewriter will teach you things. So even the writing process, I think really helps shape your understanding of what you have in front of you and what you need to ask of it.
Let me give you an example out of a particular piece of research. It wasn't a piece of research I did, but it was that one of my close colleagues did. Lynn Davidman did a project. She's a US sociologist of religion. And she was doing a project this time not on religion, but on issues of family structure. And specifically, she was interviewing men and women whose mothers had died when they themselves, when the people or interviewees were between the ages of 11 and 15. And in her generation, which is my generation, when a family member died, first, nobody talked about it. There was no public grieving. There'd be a funeral, but there was no it was not dealt with. But secondly, the cultural assumption was if a father died, the family was in financial trouble. If the mother died, the family was in emotional trouble. And that didn't matter whether that was real or not. That was the assumption. And so she wanted to find out how people recreated a sense of identity after having this grievous loss as young teenagers. Well, she asked about religion. Do you have any religious practices, et cetera? And everybody said no. And then as she was working through the data, she realized that she had a symbolic practice that was quasi-religious. That is, she kept a little table next to her front door with a picture of her mother and a shawl that her mother had liked because her mother had died when she was 12 and nobody had talked about it. And at that point, she went back and called up the 60 people she'd interviewed and said, have you got anything kind of like that? It may not be religious, et cetera, et cetera. Every one of them had something. It was the word religious that had thrown it off. But everyone had something that functioned in that way. So you can find out, sometimes the things come up with your typewriter, you're working on your typewriter, working on your computer, lead you back into the field to find out.
No, thank you, Jim. Yes, I will follow up on that momentarily. There's a question on the chat. Can you speak again on logic as structure? So while you are thinking of that, let me just follow up with a footnote. I think what you are getting at is sometimes what I think about asking people to think about plan B and C. Because you wrote your proposal, you set out to interview X and Y and Z, and you get all the motivation here. You even had contacted these folks and they tell you, oh yeah, that's fine. And when things break down, things change. And you get back to them and they say, oh yes, although I told you I will grant you an interview, now no more. Although I agree you should come to my church, now I don't want to see any researcher. If I get you at my gate, I get you arrested. So when that happens to you, what do you do? What is your plan B? What is your plan C? And I think this also has to do with the kind of questions are not necessarily fixed and set in stone. There's a kind of forward and backwards refining process that we must be thinking about. So if I ask each of you, what is your plan B? Do you have a plan B? Do you have a plan C? No matter how beautiful and interesting your questions are, suppose communication breaks down. Suppose actually what you find at the initial stage actually make nonsense of your questions. So I think these are questions and things we should put at the back of our minds. So maybe you come back on the question of the logical structure, and then we'll see what Jehu or Retiv would like to chip in here.
Okay, well, let me put up the slide that talks about logical structures, because this one is, it's easier to see it. And I think that ought to be, I think it ought to be visible at this point. You can see the slide, yes? Okay, good. The place of the logical structure is that when you've got a research question, you want to draw some kind of conclusions from your research question. You've got a question, but then the issue is, what do you want to do with the answer? Do you want to prove that things are related? Do you want to prove that there's causality? Do you want to prove that A and B always go together, but there isn't necessarily causality between them? Or do you not care about causality at all? Are you interested in doing something else? And so there are lists in various research books about, what kind of research you're trying to do. And my point with the logical structure is that simply that it's an important question to decide early, because, for example, in some of these cases where I pointed out that people were asking about causality, but their research method wasn't going to get them there, then you can change your data collection method in order to get you there. But here are the groups that I put up yesterday. And we've got the relationships, which are these, experiments of one kind or another, or correlation research, which is, well, we don't know what the relationship is between the X and Y, but we do know that there is a relationship between them. Maybe something else causing it. So for example, in the United States, if you take the 50 states of the United States and you rank those states by the number of Baptists, the percentage of the population that is Baptist in those states, you get a certain list. And then if you rank those states by the murder rate, that is, how many murders are there, and you rank the states, it's the same ranking. They are highly, highly correlated. Likewise, in the United States, if you rank the states by the suicide rates, the highest states are on the West Coast and the lowest states are on the East Coast. Well, does this mean that there's something, what's going on here? It isn't the case that Baptists are committing the murders, nor is it the case that people who go to listen to Baptist sermons come out and murder people, nor is it the case that the Baptists are murdered more than anybody else. These are pure correlations, and in fact, they depend on a third variable. But there's still a relationship. And so you want to know, what's the nature of the relationship? Well, in this case, the questions are do questions. Does A relate to B? Do C, D, and E always go together? Does a particular religious discourse shape people's shape people's actions in a particular way? Those are all relationship questions. Descriptions are something different. There's no causality necessarily. These are what questions, either what happened, what do people think, what does the worldview, do people's worldviews look like, what are the elements of their theologies that they find most important, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No causality involved. Now, the point is, you've got to decide which of these you're interested in. And that's a key part of the design process. That's really all I'm saying. Now, does that help a bit with the question, whoever asked the question about logical structures, Rodian? Does that?
Yeah, Rodian, are you smiling now or still confused? Okay, I think he's not speaking. Yeah, Rodian?
I'm smart. Yes, I wanted to say I am smiling. The thing is that I wanted to understand how that is related to methodology.
Well,
even at that stage, you're already thinking about your methodology.
Yeah, it's the second step, because when you know what you want to do with your knowledge, then you will know what kind of data you need to locate. So if I, flip back through a few of these things here. Here we've got our 6 steps. What do you want to know? What do you want to do with it? What type of data you need? And that's really the connection. The type of data, if you get a type of data that won't show causality and you want causality, then you need a different type of data. And it's that data type that's central to the process. So research question and logical structure produce the type of data you want. If you can't get that data, well, go back and figure out either you want a different logical structure or a different research question. That's the spot. And I use the word methodology very broadly. It's describing the whole set of the method. It's the research design process. It's not just a study of a particular set of methods. Research is much broader than that. And my argument is we need to think about it holistically.
Thank you, Jim. I think you point to the distinction between research methods and research methodology, which is often conflated. People don't think about the difference. I do have 2 questions in the chat, one for Jehu and one for you. So I will read Jehu's question, but also prefix that with the fact that every method, every approach has pitfalls. So you just need to be aware of what limitations that your approach brings. And I think this is partly why mixed methods or polymethodic approaches becomes very important. What one misses, the other complements. So the specific question from Felix to Jehu is, you mentioned about the pitfalls of grounded theory. May you please speak to that again, especially in light of the presentation thus far? And then Jim, the question from Felicity. I'm curious to know about the community entry experiences you've had over the years of research. So we can take those 2 and then we look forward to other questions or comments. So Jehu, would you like to give that a shot first? You are muted, please.
Sorry about that. I'm actually pleased that this question is being asked in the context of Professor Spickard's, going back to the presentation about structure, methodology, how research questions tie to the type of data that's been collected. Because I think, generally speaking, while we must accept that grounded theory comes with a lot of possibilities, there's sometimes the assumption that it dispenses with some of these, critical elements of research design. I mentioned lit review earlier. The paradox is that grounded theory really purports, rather claims that you're not going to be tied to any pre-existing theory as you collect your data. But grounded theory is itself a theory. So if you say that's what's the operative approach in your work, you're already working with a particular theory. But more to the point, the limitations I was trying to draw attention to have to do with the fact that bottom-up research, bottom-up perspectives or approaches, by definition, push the researcher into collecting huge amounts of data because the focus is lived reality, the lived human experience, human societies and how they function and so on. So a lot of data is collected, and it's very easy to lose sight of the forest for the trees. So that's actually one of the primary pitfalls, because then you end up with tons of description and with inordinate amounts of data that then make it difficult to explain particular trends, connections, and to analyze. So it's important to go into this knowing that that can be a challenge or a problem. And like I said, we find the same thing in social historical research, that once you make the whole of society your reference point and not simply elite contribution and institutional agents, the scope is much wider, and that can create enormous amounts of data for the researcher, and that can bring its own problems. I made the point about hyper subjectivity, and what I was simply trying to say is I wasn't suggesting that subjectivity is absent from any kind of research, and I would agree with the earlier comment that complete objectivity is a myth. When I discuss this with my students, I talk about rigorous subjectivity. In other words, subjectivity that's informed, and you try to be aware of your own innate biases, preferences, and so on. But with grounded theory, there is a very strong tendency to privilege one's particular angle of inquiry and thinking and assumptions. That's also something Professor Spickard addressed yesterday. We work from a particular place, and the ability to constantly engage in self-query and assessing the terms and basis of one's ideas is really crucial in doing grounded theory well. Again, I feel in the African context where we have a strong emphasis on the collective, on the community, maybe that's not as big an issue. But I find in the Western context where grounded theory has been used, it's been seen as a way for the individual to produce their own individual theology, which has all kinds of, creates its own problems, I would say. And the last thing I believe I mentioned, now I can't remember the third thing. Maybe I've already said enough.
Let me underline how important it is what you've just said. That grounded theory was developed in a particular time and place in order to produce answers about qualitative settings where nobody knew anything about what was going on. So the first case was interactions on a hospital ward. And there was no way to study that in the old sociological system. And so Blaus and Strauss, the two originators, put together a very meticulous system of taking notes in order to find out what was happening, in order to find out about the interactions that were going on there, which the existing sociological methods couldn't approach.
Yeah.
Those techniques of memos and note-taking and ways of letting things percolate up from the bottom and so on have now become fetishized.
Yes.
And in fact, there are some times when they don't help you answer your research question. I'll find somebody who's collected a lot of data when what they're really interested in is discourse analysis, which is very, very different than, I've got a young colleague who's doing this right now. They're doing a grounded theory approach, and what they're really looking at is to what degree are people influenced by the public discourses around science and religion. It'd be much easier to do a discourse analysis of particular texts or interviews, etc. But they're buried in data that they don't need.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank you.
Jim,
Yeah.
for that intervention. And Jehu, I think this is very important. And I wanted to go back to a point that was raised yesterday. I think Tunde raised that about data saturation, which Jim, you responded to. And I think that is very important. And I usually liken this to collecting PhD research data, and you are writing a PhD thesis. There's no one who exhausts the data in a PhD thesis when you finally write it. So much of the data, sometimes even 40% of the data you collect doesn't fit. You don't squeeze it into your PhD thesis. And I think those are very important questions that we need to keep in focus. The second point is about self-reflexivity. And I think this is the other point Jehu is alluding to, and to which Jim raised yesterday. Social locationality, but also our positionality are very important in determining how we respond to the kind of questions that we set out. So from what social location, from what cultural location, from what cognitive location are you raising the questions? What eyes are you using, to see what you are seeing? And the eyes you are using and the hat that you wear sometimes shape and reshapes both your questions, but also the kind of intended outcome. So we should not lose sight of that. And I think as scholars, we should constantly engage in self-reflexivity. Otherwise, we will just be chasing shadows. So let me come back to Jim. The question raised by Felicity, and then there are two other questions that have just come up for Jim. The second one is from Benson. In investigating real life situation, is it possible for the researcher to find him or herself in the same real life situation being investigated? If so, how does the researcher navigate through the situation? And I think, again, this resonates with, self-reflexivity. So Jim, please.
Well, community entry is always an issue, and you have to get permission. And it partly depends on the nature of the organization or group that you're working with. If you're working in a church, most churches, the pastor or the bishop is going to be the gatekeeper. And you need to get them wanting you there, and you need their statement to the folks who are there that, yes, this is all right. You can talk to him. He's doing something useful for us. He's going to give us information, that she's going to give information to us that we need to know. So finding a gatekeeper of someplace, something like that, is a big help. In the Episcopal study, that was relatively easy because I was part of a big study, and they were thrilled to have been nominated as a spiritually vital congregation, and they kind of wanted to know what that meant too. So everyone was willing to talk to me. In the Japanese church, I mean, these things are always stories, and I was very young when I did that. And I went because a potential girlfriend was the first Anglo minister of this group. And I was interested in hanging out with her. And it seemed like a good place to go and do it. And the relationship didn't last. I mean, we're still friends, but the romance didn't last. But when the people in the church found out that I'd been trained as an anthropologist, they said to me, "Oh, this is wonderful. We want to learn how to translate our theology into something Americans can understand." And they didn't know anything about anthropology other than anthropologists work across cultures. So they wanted something from me. And I ended up working with them. So it was 2 years of conversation. Now, that's kind of an answer that leads us to an answer to the question that Benson asked, which is what happens when you become the object of investigation by the people who are inviting you in. Simon Coleman is a British ethnographer, works on Pentecostal megachurches, writes about when he was doing his doctoral dissertation. He was an anthropologist, and they wanted to learn his cross-cultural techniques so that they could do better mission work and target this was a Swedish Pentecostal group. They wanted to learn how to target their missionizing better. And they thought anthropologists had the notion about that. But there's an even more interesting case. Susan Friend Harding is an anthropologist who went, this is 20 years ago, went to the organization of Jerry Falwell Sr., who was a fundamentalist, very political preacher with a big church operation. And she wanted to understand how that worked. And so she went to Falwell and got an interview with him and said, look, this is what I'd like to find out. And she was astonished that Falwell said yes. And furthermore, he gave her complete run of the organization and wanted to talk to her relatively frequently. And it turns out over the course of, a couple of years of research that he thought she was a potential convert. He thought God had sent her to him to find Christ. And so as a pastor, he was trying to convert her by being completely real and honest with her. And that called her to be completely real and honest with him. And she writes that it was ultimately she did not convert, but she recognized the integrity with which he was operating. And at that point in American religious politics, very few people thought that Jerry Falwell had integrity, and she demonstrated that he did. So how do you deal with it? Depends on what they're trying to do with you. Does that help, Benson?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. We have about 13 minutes, and I want you, Jim, to skip some coffee. I know Wenda is just about going to the beach. So before he does that, Wenda, please, your intervention, if he's not already swimming. And if he's swimming already, perhaps Damaris, you are still on the shore of the beach. Could you chip in anything?
Yeah, I doubt Wenda is in the beach because it's dark. Let me not turn my video on. But I'm so intrigued by what Jim has just said, and I was reminded of the time I was researching on mega Pentecostal churches in Kenya, and access was completely denied to me by the big men of God. And that shaped how I did my research. It still shapes how I undertake research with Pentecostal churches. And I wanted to ask Jim, how do our grantees navigate possible situations of collecting data in spaces where access is denied, or in spaces of hostility, or even in spaces where clergy would want to tell you what you want to hear? Like I have tried to do research on prosperity gospel, and I've tried to ask clergy about the sources of their finances, or even just to show me records of the kind of data the kind of money that they collect, and they get very dodgy and sometimes quite a bit of hostility there. And so I just wanted you to speak to that challenge, because there's also, at least in my situation and in my case, I am of the opinion that a large number of Pentecostal clergy are not receptive to researchers. And I say that based on my own personal experiences again. I remembered when I was a fellow at the University of Cambridge, I came with a journalist, a Western-based journalist, to interview a leading Pentecostal clergy in Kenya, but he denied me. He had denied me access, but allowed the journalist access. So just the politics of data collection and the possible sort of challenges that our grantees and ourselves as researchers find in the field.
Thank you, Damaris. Jim, Hereta just whispered to me she has a similar related comment. Hereta, can you unmute and add your voice before Jim responds?
Yeah, when it comes to that, my question is more of when you get to talk to somebody and the respondent leaves you feeling that that's not the answer or the response you want to hear, or just gives you that eerie feeling that this person, he's answering your question for answering sake. What does your gut feeling tells you at that stage, and what do you do? How else do you go about it, getting that person to talk to you? Because there are times you go to the field and you know somebody is just talking to you to chase you away. For instance, 2 weeks ago, I was talking to somebody and this person actually gave me money to go away. Say, foil your car and go. We were in a small group. We went to talk to this Ethiopian guy because he didn't want to talk to us. He said, take this money and foil your car and go. We didn't need his money, but he didn't want us and he doesn't want to talk to us. And another person would just tell you something they will tell you something that is not reasonable. So how do you relate to that?
Oh, it happens all the time. And you can't always get the information that you want. And people have a right to determine what information they're willing to give you or not. They have a right to deny you access to information. Maybe, let me give you another example. That same interview study I did on religious social activists. I was doing a lot of these interviews in Los Angeles, and I'd gotten into the Catholic network and interviewed probably 10 folks. And almost all of them said, look, you've got to go to and I forget the name of it, but it was a Women's Peace and Justice, Catholic Women's Peace and Justice Center, something like that. And you got to talk to the people there. So I made an appointment and sent them the information that I was, they wanted to know what I was doing, and I sent them the information and so on. And where I was living was a 2-hour drive to get to them. And so, but I was a single parent at that point, and I put my kids in daycare and drove the 2 hours and arrived at the time of the appointment and walked in, and they looked at me and said, who are you? I said, well, I'm Jim Spickard. I'm doing this project, and we agreed to have a meeting. Did we really talk to you? Did you talk to us? Well, tell us what you're doing. And I told them what I'm doing. And they said, well, can't possibly meet with you today. Can you come back next week? So I drove home, got the kids out of daycare. Next week, same thing, driving in. And I walk in the door and at the right time, and they say, who are you? What are you doing? What This time they asked who else I'd interviewed. And so I gave them the list of people that I've interviewed, and they started making comments about these folks. So, well, she's pretty good, but that guy's a priest. He can't possibly know what he's talking about. And finally, one of the 3 people in the office said, all right, look, I'll interview him. And so we went in the back room and I interviewed this person about the relationship between her spiritual life and her political life. And 10 minutes into the interview, she took her glasses off and she set them on the table. And at that point, I knew I had an interview because she was being completely honest and very deep. And then we finished up the interview. We went out and she said to the rest of them, he's okay, he actually listens. And the backstory was that they had too many journalists come in already having written the story that they wanted a good quote for. and they had been, what we would call it, having been burned by the journalists. The only way that I can get around, I've ever been able to get around this, is to convince people that I really do care about what they have to tell me, and that I'm not interested in putting them in a box. And then it's more likely that they'll speak to me, but they don't all. And then I simply have to say, okay, is there a reason? When I look at the set, is there a set of people who would not speak to me? And is there a reason for that? And usually there is. And if I can figure that out, then I can figure out the limitations of my data. I don't know if that helps or not, but what you're both are describing is very, very common. You're muted, Afa.
Yeah, we do have 5 minutes, and I don't want us to go beyond that, but we have one more question by Reko. I will read it while you think about it, then I would ask Joel or Retif for their intervention. So the question, what of gender and age issues, especially when researchers are women or younger, trying to interview an older or powerful woman who feels disrespected by the interview process? So just before you take that on, could I ask Retif any intervention?
Yeah. There's one question farther up. Can one develop grounded theologies based on our own experience? And I would like to speak to that one as well.
So I have a practical kind of question or comment, which doesn't have to be answered at this point, but it's just something to maybe keep in mind. So it relates to this issue raised about self-reflexivity that was mentioned, but also the question of linking up the questions with the research approach. And so practically now, in terms of what's going to happen in this project, you have these groups of researchers who go out for a 3-year period doing research. So my sort of back question is, what about the investment people have in a specific question, for example? There's sort of a psychological drive to all of that. The worry is sort of that the question that they have up front may be difficult to change internally for them because they're so invested in this idea already. And it may take quite a long time for them to be able to, adjust given, maybe the discovery that the data is not suited to this kind of question. So any advice or tips about, coming to an agreement that, look, our questions are problematic, or the data needs to change or whatever. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Retif. Wenda just came back from the beach, and he wants to chip in 1 or 2 things before Jim.
Well, I've got 3 questions in line here.
Yeah, you will choose whatever question you like.
I can hang out for a while longer, so that's not an issue.
Okay, just Wenda might just be maybe not a question, but a commentary. Wenda, would you like to chip in quickly?
Yes, Afe, thank you. I think what I wanted to say, I heard from both Henrietta and Damaris, and I wanted to say that when you carry out research, especially in ethnography, you triangulate, you ask multiple people the same, hoping to get the same information. So if the big man, big woman doesn't want to give you information, are there other people who might have the same kind of information that you can look for and find it? And it takes spending time with them until that you are trusted enough that they can give you that information. So I think there will be cases where, yes, they want to restrict the kind of information you're looking for until they can trust you enough, and also that you can ask the same question differently and using different people and different sources. Thank you, Afe.
Thank you, Wenda. So Jim, yes, you have the last word.
Well, I'm going to try to tag in a series of questions here for the one of those that in the chat is about gender and age issues, and it says specifically, what do you, if a woman or younger person trying to interview an older or powerful woman who feels disrespected by the interview process? The only part of that you can control is whether you are respectful or not. You can't control what they think about you. You can't control their age, the status difference, and so on. You can come to them with respect. And if they don't recognize that, they're not going to give you useful information anyway. So there's no formula for it, but going in honestly listening to people really makes a difference. Then you become an insider in a sense. And I've had situations that working with a Catholic worker, I was there long enough that people forgot I was a university professor. And I remember working in the kitchen at one point, washing dishes along with a homeless guy. And so there was a while we were talking about one thing and another. And at some point he turns to me and says, well, what do you do? I said, well, I teach college. And he looked at me. He said, I've never met anyone who's been to college, let alone teaching it. And then we went back to washing dishes. It was because it was clear that we've been, human beings with each other. And that is one of the things you can bring with you into the field, being a human being. Now, the issue about developing grounded theologies or grounded theories based on our own experience, I am very leery of autoethnography or doing things based on that where your data comes from your own experience. It's great to use your own experience to help you craft your questions. But one of the things about empirical research is you need to step out of what has happened to you and take a look at what has happened to other people. Because what has happened to you is really, by definition, very subjective. Now, the one exception to that in sociology and anthropology is that what we study are the social patterns that shape people's lives. And like everybody else, I've had social patterns that shape my life. And so I can use my own experience as an example of a social pattern shaping a life, but I can't use it as my only data. And so in the course of what I've talked the past couple of days, I've given you a bunch of examples from my research, but none of them are about me. They're all about the patterns of research. So you need to be very careful with that. Now, Retief, can you repeat your question really quickly?
Yeah, sorry, John, that was a bit complicated, I think, but I'm thinking about the practicalities of the research teams in this project going into the field. And then maybe they are heavily invested already. There are several different people involved in a project, like agreed beforehand, this is going to be the question where we're asking all the series of questions. At what point can they change things if they're already so invested? Yeah, that's...
COVID is the perfect example of that. I have the brightest undergraduate student that I've ever had did essentially a master's degree work for her senior thesis. And then we got a research grant to fund her going to interview, to find out what's going on in multi-generational, multiracial congregations in the United States, which are very rare. And she worked everything out, set everything up, and then COVID hit, and she couldn't travel, and she's immunocompromised, and she couldn't figure out what was going. She couldn't do the interviews, she couldn't do the field work on Zoom, and those churches weren't able to meet. So what do you do with a research project at that point? You become very flexible, and you get the interviews you can, and you change your research project. In this case, the grant well, she's got another year to run on the money, but she's having trouble spending all of it between now and then. But you've got to be willing to say, okay, look, this is what I designed to do. And then this is what happened when I was there. And so this is what I can write about, or what we as a team can write about. And granting agencies are usually pretty good about that. And research directors, team directors are usually pretty good about that, because they'll help you think through, well, okay, like we had a, little civil war in places like that. I mean, there are things, this just happens. So we become flexible. If we try to force it, we will end up with bad research.
Thank you so much, Jim.
I'm sorry to speak out of turn,
okay.
But that comment, that Professor Spicker's last comment is, I think, to my mind, particularly valuable because we're in a COVID environment.
Sure.
And I think all our teams, all our researchers know that there is unpredictability, there's some uncertainty about things moving forward that might have implications for the research. So that's a very valuable note to end on, I might say, that we need to constantly think about the adaptability issues we usually have to deal with in research anyway, but I think particularly now, and that's a point you've made already, particularly now, teams need to be in full communication with Nagel Institute, with project leaders and so on, to make those those adjustments, which may well turn out to be critical. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
don't apologize. You are a wise man.
Thanks, Jehu, and thanks, Jim. Yeah, I think this all boils back to the point about Plan B and C, or even Plan D, because, and I think we've taken that on board already, because I remember that even before this workshop, when we interacted with the different themes, we told them, look, we are dealing with engaging African realities, but at the same time, we have to be attentive to the current realities. So the idea of actually budgeting, and thinking about online or other ways of conducting interview, like either through Zoom or through WhatsApp or through phone, these are acceptable means because there are no other ways to do that. You can't go to churches now. So a number of people are beginning to actually look at visual-based research, which is one of those ways of adjusting. And so take it on board that your proposal is one thing, but this is when to get your fingers dirty. And there are many issues related to this that you might take back home, reflect, and then discuss with your PAs on what is realizable, what is doable at this given point in time, and how does that impact back on your original questions and objectives, and so on and so forth. Yeah, but this is an ongoing conversation. We have another couple of days to deal with this. First thing, just to close, please make sure that you sign the attendance form. The link is on the chat. We do this at least once in a day just to gauge the attendance. We don't want anyone to be lost. So the best way to find you is to make sure you complete the attendance. The second, I just want to show deep appreciation to Juliana and Dennis, our interpreters, because it's not an easy thing to interpret simultaneously. And sometimes we might be overstretching them. Like I talk very fast, I'm thinking of the time, but they have to break this down to our interpreters. So Juliana and Dennis, our deep gratitude to you for your resilience. To Jim, thank you so much for this additional engagement. And we don't underestimate what you bring to this conversation. Unfortunately, Bruce is not able to be here. He must still be snoring now. So we hope that we can bring him back at some point in the next days to answer additional questions that you have about grounded theology. But I want to end by saying that all kinds of theologies and approaches that we are thinking about here, there's no single approach or methodology that is foolproof. Every approach, every theory has its upside and downside. And to be conscious of this, two-dimensional perspective of each approach or methodology that we use is creatively important. So let's digest this, and I think tomorrow is another day, and we say that older wine or the sweetest wine is saved, or the best wine is saved towards the end. So I think as the days are going, things are getting, even sweeter. So I want to thank you for your contributions, either in terms of questions or in terms of comments, both to the speakers and to the exchanges we've had. This is creatively productive. And I would like to also thank our research associates for all what you do behind the scenes to ensure continuity. We also do recognize the challenges of power. I know some of our participants are not able to join us up till now because of power cuts or internet cuts. These are the realities that the Engaging African Realities Project needs to think through as we go forward. So thank you for all you have contributed to the success of today, and get refreshed for tomorrow is another day. So tomorrow we are not starting at 11 a.m. We are reverting back to the 1 p.m. So take note of that. And this is GMT. And then, yes, so I am fired up. I can't wait for tomorrow's program. And I suspect so do you. So thank you. And to Nelly. Yes. Thank you to Nelly and all those in the secretariat for all you have done to make today another great day.
And thank you, Afe.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Afe, for the leadership.
Thank you, facilitators.
I know.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Oh, I didn't know I was muted.
It's 7:50.
Everyone, I put the link in the chat again. Someone said that it wasn't working, and so I put the longer link in and then checked at the bit.ly, and so there's now a lot of stuff there.
Okay, no, thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Including my email in case people need to write me.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Jim, you deserve some good champagne. Yeah.
None in the house.